Right now, scattered across China, there are enough empty, unfinished apartments to house the entire population of a major European city.
Yeah, they really sit as these quiet, just deteriorating monuments to a single corporate entity.
A single company that somehow managed to rack up a debt equivalent to roughly 2% of China's entire gross domestic product.
It's staggering.
Welcome to this deep dive. This is part of our Peak to Dust investigative documentary series, and today we're taking a strictly analytical look at what is arguably the most consequential corporate implosion of the 21st century.
Right, the monumental rise and the catastrophic fall of the Evergrande Group.
It's a subject that frankly demands absolute rigor from us today.
Absolutely, because we aren't just talking about a standard company filing for bankruptcy here.
No, not at all.
We are examining how a fundamental engine of the world's second-largest economy just stalled out. And in doing so, left behind a global debris field of over $300 billion in liabilities.
So our mission today is to provide you, the listener, with an exhaustive account. We want to show how a regional property developer transformed into this national economic titan only to trigger a financial crisis with genuine global ramifications.
And to do that, we're working from a massive stack of source material.
Right. We've spent weeks analyzing Evergrande's corporate financial reports. We've dug into their internal ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance documents. And we are leaning heavily on academic analyses from institutions like the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business.
We're also pulling from independent financial audits.
Yes, including a pretty devastating report by GMT Research.
Right, alongside a decade of global financial reporting. And, synthesizing these sources reveals a terrifyingly clear picture of systemic risk.
It really does.
We're going to explore how hyperexpansion, a reliance on just unprecedented debt, and an inevitable collision with state regulatory policies dismantled a corporate empire.
An empire that many people, including its own leadership, believed was simply too big to fail.
Exactly.
So, as you listen today, keep in mind that you're exploring a textbook case of staggering corporate hubris and its devastating consequences. And to understand the scale of this collapse, we have to start at the peak.
We have to go back.
Right. Back to 1996 to Guangzhou in southern China. This is when a man named Hui Ka Yan, also known as Hui Ka Yan in Cantonese, founded the Evergrande real estate group.
But, you can't really understand why Evergrande exploded the way it did without understanding the macroeconomic tectonic plates that were shifting beneath his feet at that exact moment.
The environment was everything.
Precisely. Evergrande's birth is inextricably linked to the sweeping housing reforms initiated by the Chinese government.
Right, because before 1988, China operated on a nationwide welfare housing system.
Yeah, the state or these massive state-owned enterprises, they provided housing to workers. You didn't buy a home.
You were assigned one.
Exactly. But in 1988, and then much more aggressively in 1998, the government transitioned the country toward a private housing ownership system.
And this was a paradigm shift of historical proportions.
It was. Suddenly, housing wasn't just a basic provision anymore. It was a commodity. It became a consumer product and, critically for our story today, an investment vehicle.
And this transition happened to collide with the largest rural-to-urban human migration in recorded history.
Which is just wild to think about.
The academic analysis from the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business gives us the hard data on this. They track China's urbanization rate, which surged from 29% in 1996 to roughly 65% by 2021.
And to truly grasp the scale of that demand, we need to look at the raw human numbers involved.
Right.
Over that period, an estimated 17 million people were moving from rural areas into Chinese cities every single year.
Wait, 17 million a year?
Every single year.
Yeah.
When you have an influx of 17 million people, you require the construction of 8 to 10 million new housing units annually just to keep up.
Just to put that into perspective for you, the sources note that United States housing starts during a similar period averaged about 1.3 million units a year.
Yeah, so China was effectively building several major Western cities from scratch year after year.
The demand was functionally infinite.
Exactly. But Evergrande didn't just passively ride this macroeconomic wave. Hui Ka Yan engineered a highly specific, very aggressive strategy to dominate it.
Because when he started the company, the residential real estate market in major Tier 1 cities like Guangzhou was already fiercely competitive.
Right. Rival developers like China Vanke and China Overseas Holdings, they were heavily focused on building these mid to high-end luxury residential markets in urban centers.
But Evergrande decided to go the exact opposite direction.
He targeted the mass market.
The hundreds of millions of people who were urbanizing needed an affordable entry point. So Evergrande focused on building smaller condos in the suburbs and increasingly in lower-tier cities.
Yeah, the Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities that the luxury developers were completely ignoring.
So what was the mechanical advantage of targeting these specific lower-tier markets?
It really came down to capital efficiency. In lower-tier cities, land costs were drastically lower, development costs were lower. But the most crucial advantage was turnover speed.
Right.
Evergrande famously completed their very first project. From government approval to land acquisition, construction sales, and move-in within a single year.
Fast turnover. This is where we see the birth of their core operational philosophy. The internal documents call it the 3 highs and 1 low model.
High debt, high leverage, high turnover, and low cost.
When I look at the mechanics of this model, it operates like a hyper-efficient, highly pressurized corporate centrifuge. You pump in debt, you spin it incredibly fast to build and sell, and you extract cash to buy more land.
That's a great way to visualize it.
But the catch is that it demands constant, unrelenting forward momentum. If the centrifuge ever slows down, the entire structure collapses under its own gravitational weight.
That's a perfect analogy for how they operated. And to keep that centrifuge spinning at maximum velocity, Evergrande standardized everything.
Right, they couldn't afford any friction.
The internal documents indicate that Yu and his management team developed over 6,000 rules and procedures.
6,000.
Yeah, these protocols covered every conceivable aspect of development. They dictated how raw materials were procured, how contractors were managed, right down to what the on-site staff ate for their meals.
Wow.
Because of this extreme centralization, Evergrande could assemble a complete project development team and dispatch them within 2 hours of being notified of a project's approval.
It's literally an industrial assembly line applied to skyscrapers. But an assembly line moving that fast requires a massive continuous feed of raw materials.
Exactly.
And for a developer, that raw material is land. If they're building entire neighborhoods in a single year, how on earth were they finding enough land to keep that pace up?
Well, they had a voracious appetite for capital to fund that land acquisition. By 2004, operating on this high-debt, high-turnover model, Evergrande had expanded nationwide and ranked among the top 10 developers in China by sales.
But they needed more.
Always more. So by 2009, they took the company public on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
And this wasn't just a domestic affair either. The initial public offering raised $729 million, heavily backed by international institutional investors.
We're talking about global financial heavyweights here.
Yep.
Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, Temasek Holdings. They were pouring immense amounts of capital into this model.
Which allowed them to scale their land acquisition to a completely unprecedented level.
Right. By 2018, Evergrande held 822 pieces of undeveloped land spread across 228 cities.
That is massive.
The planned gross floor area of this land bank was 305 million square meters.
305 million square meters. It's hard to even visualize that. The sources contextualize it by comparing it to Germany, right?
Yes. That single corporate land bank was equivalent to nearly 10% of the entire housing stock of Germany.
That's just unreal.
And they paid roughly $74 billion for this undeveloped real estate.
But according to the eHouse China report, they weren't paying market rate for all this.
No, they acquired much of this land at massive discounts compared to their peers.
In 2018 alone, 57% of their new land parcels were acquired not through open government auctions, but by using their cash reserves to buy out cash-strapped projects from smaller, failing developers.
Right, which drove their average land cost down to just 1,446 yuan per square meter.
Yeah.
At a time when their competitors were seeing costs just absolutely skyrocket.
Now, that is the official narrative found in their corporate filings.
Yes.
However, this strategy of aggressive land accumulation masks severe underlying risks, and this is where we have to look closely at the independent audits.
Because the GMT research report provides a very dark counter-narrative to this supposed operational efficiency.
I want to push back on this a bit before we dive into the allegations, though.
Sure.
GMT Research is an activist short seller. Their business model is literally built on finding flaws in companies, shorting their stock, and publishing reports to drive the price down.
Yes, they profit from the decline.
So, are we just taking their allegations at face value here, or is there actual mechanical evidence behind their claims?
It's a vital distinction to make, and we must approach their claims analytically for sure.
Yeah.
However, what makes the GMT report significant is that it didn't just throw out vague accusations, it modeled the cash flows.
Okay.
GMT alleged that Evergrande was acquiring land at seemingly inconceivable discounts, sometimes 67% below peer group averages, through an untoward program of bribery aimed at local government officials.
And the mechanism for funding this alleged shadow operation is what really stands out in the report. GMT explicitly claims that to finance the growing cash flow shortfalls related to these activities, subsequent land purchases, and rapid construction, Evergrande employed a complex web of Ponzi-style financing schemes.
Yes.
How exactly does a real estate developer operate a Ponzi scheme mechanically?
Well, in a traditional Ponzi scheme, you use capital from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors, right?
Right.
In Evergrande's case, the investors were home buyers. They relied on perpetually growing pre-sales.
So selling before anything is built.
Exactly. They would sell an apartment long before it was built, collect the cash up front, and instead of putting that cash into an escrow account to build that specific apartment, they would divert it.
So they'd take the money from homebuyer A, use it to buy more land or pay off the debt on a previous project, and rely on selling a home to homebuyer B to eventually fund the construction of homebuyer A's apartment.
Precisely. And they also utilized off-balance sheet partnerships.
How'd that work?
They would create joint ventures with third parties, guaranteeing them high internal rates of return. These joint ventures would take on debt that didn't technically appear on Evergrande's primary balance sheet.
Artificially making the company look less leveraged than it actually was.
Yes, it was highly opaque.
But, I mean, this requires a compliant ecosystem to function. Why would local Chinese governments allow a developer to amass such a staggering amount of land, especially if they suspected the financing was essentially a house of cards?
Because the local governments were deeply incentivized to facilitate it. We have to look at the tax reforms of 1994 to understand this.
Okay, what happened in 94?
Under those reforms, local municipalities lost a massive share of their tax revenue to the central government in Beijing.
So they were starved for cash.
Exactly. To fund themselves to build their own infrastructure, local governments turned to the sale of land use rights.
So property transactions became the absolute lifeblood of local municipal finance.
Exactly. Evergrande was effectively bankrolling local governments. By buying massive tracts of land, Evergrande was providing the capital these municipalities needed to survive.
I see.
In return, the municipalities facilitated Evergrande's rapid expansion. It was a symbiotic relationship that allowed the company to accumulate a land bank of unprecedented proportions.
Which brings up a fascinating psychological shift within the company. When you control a land bank the size of a European nation's housing stock, when you're generating billions in pre-sales and local governments are relying on you for their very survival, a dangerous corporate belief takes root.
You start to believe you're invincible.
It's the definition of the too-big-to-fail mindset.
Right. By 2016, Evergrande had entered the Fortune Global 500. By 2017, Xu Jian had become the richest man in China, with an estimated net worth of $42.2 billion US.
Staggering wealth.
The core property business was generating vast amounts of cash on paper, and the company's management team began diverting those funds into sectors where they had absolutely no core competency.
Yeah, their diversification strategy reads less like a coherent corporate expansion and more like a billionaire's erratic shopping list.
It really does.
For instance, in 2010, they purchased the Guangzhou Football Club. And they didn't just buy it, they poured an unbelievable amount of money into it.
Millions upon millions.
They hired World Cup winning coaches like Marcello Lippi and Luis Felipe Scolari, bringing in high-priced international talent. They spent roughly $110 million just to build the largest soccer academy in the world.
And it didn't stop at professional sports either. They launched Evergrande Spring, which was a bottled water company.
Bottled water?
Yeah. They created the Evergrande Health Industry Group, investing in specialized hospitals and elderly care. They moved into life insurance, wealth management, and even established Evergrande Culture, acquiring animation production companies and a cinema line.
They also launched a massive push into tourism, planning 15 Fairyland theme park projects nationwide.
Yes, 15.
We're talking about a venture involving over $100 billion in total planned investment. But the most staggering pivot of all, the one that really highlights the sheer hubris, was their entry into the new energy vehicle, or NEV, market in 2019.
Right. They established Evergrande New Energy Auto with the explicitly stated goal of becoming the world's largest and most powerful electric vehicle maker within 3 to 5 years.
They were directly challenging Tesla.
Not with incremental growth, but through brute force capital expenditure.
The scale of the capital allocated to this pivot was astronomical. Since they didn't have any in-house automotive engineering, they just went on a global acquisition spree.
They just bought everything they needed.
Yeah, they acquired a controlling stake in zenith for power battery technology. They bought e-traction out of the Netherlands for powertrain technology. They acquired a 51% stake in National Electric Vehicle Sweden for nearly $1 billion.
And they built massive Industry 4.0 standard smart manufacturing bases in Shanghai and Guangzhou.
And then in August 2020, they held a massive global launch for 6 models of their Hengxi vehicle line, covering everything from sedans to SUVs.
And the market bought into the spectacle.
Oh, they definitely did.
At its peak, the market capitalization of this EV subsidiary hit $87 billion.
Yeah.
It was valued higher than the Ford Motor Company.
Yet at that peak valuation of $87 billion, Evergrande New Energy Auto had not produced or sold a single commercial vehicle.
Not one.
How does a company achieve that kind of valuation without a product? This is where that analytical framework provided by GMT Research becomes vital again.
Right, because the GMT report alleged that these non-core expansions, the soccer team, the theme parks, the EV company, they were not genuine attempts at business diversification.
What were they then?
Rather, they were elaborate vanity projects that were hemorrhaging cash.
Yeah.
But more importantly, GMT suggested these projects served a dual purpose.
Okay.
Billions of renminbi were being diverted to them to mask severe underlying financial instability in the core property business.
It's a classic misdirection strategy. If you create a spectacle of infinite wealth, if you own a championship football team, a sprawling theme park empire, and an $87 billion car company, you project an aura of total solvency to your creditors and homebuyers.
All while the foundation is actually crumbling beneath you.
Precisely, because behind the scenes, the company was maintaining its liquidity by issuing massive amounts of high-yield offshore bonds.
Yeah, they were utilizing highly opaque trust loans.
They were aggressively expanding wealth management products that they sold directly to retail investors, often their own employees or homebuyers.
The 3 highs in 1 low model had morphed from a strategy for building homes into a desperate daily scramble for cash just to service their existing debt.
Just to give a sense of the math here, before the eventual government clampdown, Evergrande's net gearing ratio, which, for you listening, is a metric showing a company's debt relative to its equity, essentially measuring how much of their operations are funded by borrowed money.
Right, a critical health metric.
That ratio was more than double that of the next most leveraged developer in China.
They were walking a tightrope of astronomical leverage. And as long as the macroeconomic environment tolerated infinite borrowing, the centrifuge kept spinning.
But that reality came to a violent and abrupt end.
It did.
Which brings us to the catastrophic decline. Evergrande's entire hyper-expansion model relied on an environment that implicitly guaranteed they could always borrow more to pay off what they owed yesterday.
But in August of 2020, the state fundamentally altered that reality.
The Chinese government, under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, had been growing increasingly alarmed by the systemic risks posed by the property sector.
Xi had famously declared that houses are for living in, not for speculation. The Seed recognized that the real estate sector had become dangerously overheated and was relying far too heavily on the unregulated shadow banking system.
To clarify, when we talk about shadow banking in this context, we're talking about financial intermediaries that facilitate credit creation across the financial system, but whose members are not subject to regulatory oversight.
Right, they are acting like banks, lending money, but outside the safety nets and rules that traditional banks follow.
Exactly. So to curb this unregulated lending and cool the broader property bubble, the People's Bank of China and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development introduced a policy known as the 3 red lines.
And this policy is the turning point of the entire Evergrande narrative.
The 3 red lines were strict financial metrics that selected large real estate developers were suddenly assessed against. Let's outline exactly what these metrics were because they acted as a financial guillotine for the company.
Okay, red line number 1. A 70% ceiling on the liability to asset ratio, excluding advance receipts from presales.
Red line number 2, a 100% cap on the net debt to equity ratio.
And red line number 3, a cash to short-term borrowing ratio of at least 1, meaning you had to have enough actual cash on hand to cover all the debt coming due within the next year.
Right, and if a developer failed these metrics, they were categorized by colors green, orange, yellow, and red.
Which legally dictated the extent to which they were allowed to grow their debt in the following year.
If you crossed all 3 red lines, if you landed in the red category, you were legally forbidden from raising any additional interest-bearing debt.
And Evergrande failed all 3 metrics completely.
Completely.
By the end of 2021, their debt-to-asset ratio stood at an abysmal 82.59%. Their net gearing ratio was drastically over the limit, and their cash reserves were wholly insufficient to cover their short-term obligations.
So the policy achieved exactly what the state intended.
Yeah.
It forced highly leveraged companies to stop borrowing and deleverage. But for a company like Evergrande, whose entire operational lifeblood was the constant acquisition of new debt to pay off old debt, being cut off from fresh financing was an instant death sentence.
It severed their ability to refinance through shadow banking, trust loans, and offshore bonds.
The timing was just devastating because Evergrande's debt structure was highly vulnerable. By the end of 2021, over 40% of their debt was short-term.
Wow.
The industry average at the time was around 32%. This means they were relying heavily on short-term debt money that had to be paid back quickly to fund long-term, highly illiquid projects like raw land reserves and electric vehicle factories.
Right, you can't sell an unfinished EV factory in a week to pay off a bond.
Exactly. When the credit window slammed shut, their liquidity dried up almost overnight.
This triggers the unmasking of the $300 billion debt crisis. We need to break down the sheer terrifying scale of this collapse.
It's massive.
Total liabilities swelled to 2.58 trillion yuan, over 300 billion US dollars. To put that in perspective, that single corporate entity's debt was equivalent to roughly 2% of China's entire gross domestic product.
So how does a single company accumulate that much hidden liability without setting off alarm bells globally?
That's the real question.
It represents a profound systemic failure of risk management and, critically, a failure of auditing. The sources indicate that Evergrande relied heavily on highly questionable accounting practices to artificially inflate their position for years.
Right. They were playing games with the balance sheet. They counted unbuilt and unsold properties as tangible assets.
They even counted the interest payments they were making on loans as assets rather than expenses.
I mean, that artificially inflated the size of the company and masked the fact that they were severely insolvent.
It made them look like a sprawling, wealthy empire on paper while they were bleeding cash in reality.
This brings us to a major point of pushback regarding the corporate ecosystem surrounding Evergrande. Where were the auditors in all this? We have to question the role of the firms being paid millions of dollars to verify these exact numbers. I look at this delayed realization of insolvency, and it looks exactly like a facade on a Hollywood movie set.
That's a good way to put it.
You walk down the street, and it looks like a bustling, wealthy metropolis. But if you walk behind the buildings, they are just thin sheets of plywood held up by 2x4s. Structurally, the whole thing is completely hollow. How does a major accounting firm miss that?
That is an incredibly accurate assessment of their financial architecture. And the consequences for the architects of that facade have been severe, albeit delayed.
Right.
We must look at the recent 2024 fallout for PwC Zhongtian, which was Evergrande's primary auditor on the mainland.
What happened there?
Chinese regulators imposed a staggering 441 million yuan fine on the firm, roughly 62 million US dollars, and handed down a 6-month suspension of their audit activities.
The scale of the oversight failure detailed in that ruling is mind-boggling. The authorities found that Evergrande had overstated its revenue by an unbelievable $78 billion over a 2-year period leading up to the crash.
78 billion.
How do you fake $78 billion?
Yeah.
The mechanism was that they were recognizing revenue from pre-sold apartments before they were actually built and delivered.
Right, they were counting cash they had collected for future promises as current profit.
And the auditors just signed off on it.
And the repercussions for PwC have been profound. It triggered a mass exodus of their other clients, the resignation of dozens of partners, and severe reputational damage globally.
Because it highlighted a critical failure in global audit oversight, proving that the watchdogs were either completely asleep at the wheel or actively complicit, while the world's most indebted developer built a house of cards.
So the credit is cut off by the three red lines, the true scale of the debt is revealed, and the crisis goes public.
Right. In late 2021, Evergrande began missing interest payments on its offshore dollar-denominated bonds.
And for you listening, offshore bonds are debt securities issued outside of China, usually in US dollars, bought heavily by international investors seeking high yields.
When they missed those payments, international ratings agencies like Fitch and Moody's issued severe credit downgrades, eventually declaring the company in restricted default.
The reaction across global markets was intense and immediate. There were widespread comparisons in the financial press to the 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers.
I remember that panic.
The S&P 500 suffered its worst day in months, and the VIX Volatility Index, which measures the stock market's expectation of volatility, basically a fear gauge for investors, spiked dramatically.
Investors were terrified of contagion because the interconnectedness was vast. 128 banking institutions and 121 non-banking institutions were directly exposed to Evergrande's debt.
I want to stop and analyze the validity of that Lehman Brothers comparison, though.
Okay.
While the panic was real, isn't the structural reality of China's financial system fundamentally different from the West's?
It is.
In 2008, the contagion spread because banks didn't know who held the toxic assets, so they just stopped lending to everyone, freezing the global system. But China's system is state-controlled, isn't it?
That's a critical distinction. The Lehman collapse triggered a sudden, uncontrolled freeze of the global interbank lending market. In China, the state exerts heavy, direct control over the banking sector and the financial system as a whole.
All right.
Because Beijing can dictate lending terms and mandate stability, analysts characterize the Evergrande crisis not as a sudden, chaotic collapse, but as a controlled implosion managed by the state.
The state stepped in to prevent a systemic banking freeze, utilizing tools like lowering the reserve requirement ratio, essentially reducing the amount of cash banks are legally required to hold in reserve.
Which injected fresh liquidity into the broader market.
Exactly. But while the banking system held up under state intervention, the real estate sector itself was devastated by a domino effect.
The contagion spread rapidly to other highly leveraged developers.
Companies like Country Garden, which was actually China's largest developer by sales volume, and Cynic Holdings, found themselves plunged into a severe liquidity freeze.
The entire sector, which alongside related industries like construction and materials, accounted for up to 30% of China's GDP, just ground to a halt.
Land sales plummeted, construction sites went quiet, and a deep, systemic chill settled over the Chinese economy.
Which brings us to the most tragic aspect of this deep dive, the human cost.
Yes, we have to talk about this.
We are dealing with astronomical financial figures, billions and trillions, but behind every delayed bond payment is a devastating societal impact.
The scale of the physical ruin left behind is staggering. There were an estimated 1.4 million pre-sold but unfinished apartments left in limbo.
Think about the mechanics of the presale model we discussed earlier.
Under the 3 highs and 1 low strategy, Evergrande relied on regular families paying in full, upfront, often taking out massive mortgages for homes that would not be built for years.
Evergrande took that cash, and instead of using it to buy concrete and steel for that specific apartment, diverted it to buy more land or fund a soccer team or an EV factory.
And when the music stopped and the credit dried up, the home buyers were left holding a mortgage for an apartment that was nothing more than a dirt pit.
This resulted in extremely rare, intense public protests across China. Angry homebuyers, retail investors, and unpaid contractors besieged Evergrande's headquarters in Shenzhen.
People had poured their entire life savings into Evergrande's high-yield wealth management products, sold on the premise that a company this big couldn't possibly fail.
Which the company subsequently defaulted on.
And the physical manifestation of this crisis can be seen in the emergence of new ghost cities.
The sources cite the example of Lulan, a municipality in Anhui province.
Right. Evergrande poured investments into this lower-tier city, launching massive residential projects and an EV plant that promised to produce 500,000 cars a year. It was supposed to be an economic miracle.
But when the funds dried up,
Lucian transformed into sprawling urban decay, characterized by rows of unfinished, concrete housing blocks surrounded by farmland, completely devoid of residents. Entire districts built for a future that never arrived.
The macroeconomic terror of this situation cannot be overstated. You have to contextualize this tragedy within Chinese society.
Nearly 70% of all household wealth in China is tied up in real estate.
Unlike in the US, where wealth might be diversified in stocks or 401ks, real estate is the primary vehicle for saving and wealth generation in China.
When property values stall or plummet, and when major developers fail to deliver on 1.4 million homes, it doesn't just destroy corporate value.
No.
It obliterates the net worth of the middle class.
This severely damages domestic consumer confidence. If a family feels their primary asset, their life savings, has vanished, they immediately stop spending on everything else.
They stop buying appliances, cars, and consumer goods.
This lack of consumption leads directly to a broader economic slowdown and raises the very real specter of deflation.
And so, the behemoth finally falls. Let's detail the final liquidation phase, the long, slow death rattle.
By August 2023, Evergrande filed for Chapter 15 bankruptcy protection in New York.
For context, Chapter 15 is a mechanism that allows foreign companies to shield their U.S. assets from creditors while they attempt a restructuring in their home country.
But the fatal blow to the corporate leadership came a month later.
In September 2023, the founder, Hui Ka Yan, the man who was once the richest in China, was detained by Chinese authorities on suspicion of illegal crimes.
This effectively ended any viable negotiations with international creditors.
The company's leadership was crippled, under state investigation, and incapable of executing a restructuring plan.
Finally, in January 2024, the Hong Kong High Court issued a formal order to liquidate the China Evergrande Group.
The presiding judge ruled that the company had failed to present any viable restructuring plan for its $300 billion in liabilities, and that enough was enough.
The liquidation process is now ongoing, but it's critical to understand the hierarchy of priorities in this state-managed wind-down.
The primary focus of the Chinese government is maintaining social stability above all else.
Therefore, the liquidation prioritizes the delivery of those 1.4 million pre-sold homes to domestic buyers and the payment of domestic suppliers and contractors who actually build the properties.
And where does that leave the international investors, the ones who bought those high-yield offshore dollar bonds?
They are at the very back of the line. Furthermore, the legal firewall between Hong Kong, where the liquidation order was issued, and mainland China, where most of the assets actually reside, severely complicates the enforcement of the order.
Analysts estimate that offshore creditors face catastrophic losses, with recovery rates projected at a dismal 3 to 5% of their original claims.
As we conclude this deep dive, we have to synthesize the sheer magnitude of what we've uncovered today.
The Evergrande Group was not merely a real estate company.
It was the ultimate symbol of China's hyper-growth era. It was a titan built on an unprecedented foundation of debt, operating with reckless leverage, fueled by systemic accounting fraud, and sustained by a societal belief that the property market would only ever go up.
And its dismantling serves as a profound historical lesson. It demonstrates the inherent, catastrophic fragility of any economic model reliant on perpetual leverage.
It also serves as a stark reminder of sovereign power.
Right. No corporate entity, regardless of its size, its hundreds of thousands of employees, or its global footprint, is truly too big to fail when a state government decides to fundamentally shift its macroeconomic policy to prevent systemic ruin.
You've just traced the arc from peak to dust. From a regional developer exploiting sweeping housing reforms, to a global conglomerate burning cash on football teams and electric cars to mask its insolvency, to a hollow shell being liquidated in a Hong Kong courtroom.
But the ripples of this collapse are still expanding.
The physical infrastructure remains. The unfinished concrete skeletons scarring the Chinese landscape. But the financial architecture that built them is forever altered.
Which leaves us with a final, deeply troubling question to ponder.
We know that local Chinese governments have historically relied on the sale of land use rights to property developers as their primary source of revenue.
With the debt-fueled real estate engine now shattered and surviving developers unable or unwilling to buy land, how will the world's second-largest economy fund its municipal future?
And furthermore, if a severely weakened Chinese middle class leads to deep domestic deflation, and China begins exporting that deflation through heavily discounted manufactured goods to the rest of the world, is the Evergrande crisis truly over? Or is the global economy just entering the fallout zone?